Welcome back to another episode of the Strong Money Podcast. Jacob and I are going to be talking through the estate planning considerations around Bitcoin. We'll really start with kind of estate planning 101. What does it even mean to, establish an estate plan? Why would you want to do that in the first place? What documents and things are you taking care of? What does an estate plan actually look like? And then we'll start to talk through the considerations with including Bitcoin into that estate plan. So this is something that I really don't think other people are talking about right now. And I believe it's one of the most important subjects for Bitcoiners to be thinking through, maybe the most overlooked aspect of their overall financial plan. Every single person that we've talked to lately, either they didn't have an estate plan, or maybe they had a trust in place, but Bitcoin wasn't a part of that, or they haven't thought through the custody aspects around estate planning and inheritance protocols in general. So we're going to go through all of that, give you a foundation to stand on to think through your own estate plan, and then give you some clarifying information around our thoughts on it. And I think also we're going to touch on the inheritance protocols versus what, or maybe just why those inheritance protocols that everyone sells are incomplete when it comes to taking care of the entire inheritance function around your Bitcoin. I don't think a lot of people realize that, and so if you're somebody who just started listening to this, that is a incentive to listen all the way through, because we're gonna bring you information that, like I said, not many others are talking about, and that can be critical to your wife, kids, heirs, whoever, being able to access and actually own your Bitcoin if something were to happen to you unexpectedly. So I'm excited for this one. How about you?
Yeah, this one's fun. I think it's where we get to nerd out more. Everybody's favorite topic of death or dying and how to handle it. So for us, it's a very academic exercise, but yes, it'll be good.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, in our minds, I think when we're looking at most of the prospects that we're talking to right now, taxes are a big thing. How do I manage my tax bill? Whether that's as I accumulate more Bitcoin, if I'm a business owner or whatever it may be. And then both, okay, transitioning now to retirement, how do I do that in the most tax efficient way? But then number two is this one. And again, I don't think that they are thinking about this. If they are, it's not completely. And so, this is the second, maybe the first, even most important thing when it comes to your overall financial plan with Bitcoin in it specifically. So let's just start with the basics. We've written, or you have written a blog for our website going through this, so we'll follow that similar structure. But can you just walk us through kind of what an estate plan is, what that even means, and what is involved in one?
Yeah, for sure. So most people, they hear estate plan and they think, okay, well, I need to get a will in place. And while that certainly is never a bad thing to do, that would really be what we would consider an incomplete estate plan. And it really is something too. Even as I talk through this next little bit, um, it's often overlooked, the plan aspect of this, meaning that we're going to talk through a bunch of documents in a minute here, and just some things we want to have or consider and that sort of thing. But the plan aspect of it, what does that mean? Well, that means that, okay, yeah, these documents are part of how we implement the plan, but we still have to come up with, okay, what is the plan? Because those documents are communicating something. So we have to kind of say, okay, what do we want them to communicate? The documents, okay, yes, we can type those up or whatever, but if we never put them in force, then we still have an incomplete plan. And then even furthermore, if whatever we do now, needs to be changed in the future and we never do, well, then again, it's still an incomplete plan. And so estate planning is a process. And so what I mean by that is it's kind of like financial planning in general, where we can talk through a subject or talk through a topic or even put together an entire financial plan today. And as soon as, we're done with that meeting, that plan is wrong in some aspect because life changes, something happens, whatever. And so the estate plan, it's the same piece here. It's an ever evolving piece of your financial life. too. So with that big caveat said, yeah, when we talk about an estate plan, traditionally we are talking about, okay, there's specific things that we want to consider, we want to think through, and we want to document around our potential incapacitation and our guaranteed death. And basically what these documents allow us to do is to state what our wishes are in those scenarios, both with us and our our bodies, us personally, but also with the resources that we've been blessed with. And so there's several documents that really go into that estate plan. And
Mm-hmm.
what are those documents? So first and foremost, I've already stated, is a will. So a will is just a document where you can go through and you name a few things. One primary thing you name is an executor. The executor is the one who says, okay, you have some sort of estate, right? So some sort of resources. The executor is, okay, you put together a will. I'm going to try to carry out what your will, has said to do. That's what an executor's purpose is. So within a will, we name that. Again, within that will, we're also saying, okay, I want, this asset to go to this person, or I want this asset to go to that person. I want the family heirloom to go to my, niece, whatever it's going to be. One other important thing we're naming within a will is, especially if you have kids, especially young kids, is the guardian aspect. So who is going to take care of your guardians when you die? And so, this is something we don't, like to think about a lot. It's quite morbid, especially because with any, designation, any of these things that we're talking about today, if you're married, almost always is it going to be your spouse who's the immediate person who's going to carry your wishes. So, okay, the executor, that's probably going to be your spouse. But for any of these things, whether it's the executor, the guardian, or some of the other designations we're going to talk about in a bit, you always want to name both a primary and a contingent. So the contingent is if the primary can't or won't serve in the capacity you've asked them to serve, the contingent will step in and do that. And so with the will, then, when we talk about a guardian, again, it's like, well, just by the fact that they're their biological children, if you die and your spouse is still alive, your spouse is still going to take care of your children. But if you both die, right, you go on the vacation without the kids and you get in a plane crash, whatever. That's where this gets to be really, important to name, because the premise behind an estate plan, and I probably should have started with this, is that something is always going to happen to our estate when we die. It's just a matter of whether we have stated our wishes around what happens and we have formalized those wishes, or we haven't. And if we haven't stated or formalized those wishes, then who gets to decide? It's the state itself. It's the probate courts that will decide what happens with your resources, with your children. And so that is really the fundamental reason why we want to have these documents or anything else in place, is we want to state what those wishes are. And so with a will, then again, you name an executor, you name a guardian for your children. Maybe you put in there that, hey, these assets go to this person. There's every attorney does it a little bit differently, but in general, it's just kind of like the general, okay, here's what I have, here's where it goes. While a will is a good first step, most people probably shouldn't stop there. The reason is when we talk specifically about your material resources, your assets, what happens to those when you pass away. There's got to be some sort of communication network, or not network, some sort of communication mechanism to say, okay, I own this house. This house should go to this person when I die. And there's three primary ways that mechanism is communicated. First is by contract, the second is by law, and the third is the one we've been talking about, it's by probate. So by contract and law are fairly simple. By contract is you just have some sort of legal contract that says, okay, I own this asset, it goes to this person. We do this all the time when we make a beneficiary designation. So you say, hey, my investment account should go to my spouse and then to my kid, right? Like, okay, primary beneficiaries, my wife, contingent beneficiaries are my kids. That's a contract. That's legally binding. That doesn't need to go through a court process. It doesn't need to go through anything. You have a legal contract that it can be enforced that has those assets go to those people. By law, very similar. The mechanism's different. It's just, okay, you own an asset a certain way that by law it is automatically that other person's. So a simple one with this is you have a joint brokerage account. So it's not just an investment account in your name and your wife is the beneficiary. It's you and your wife own this account jointly. So if you die, okay, well then your wife she has full control over that account. Again, no other nothing, no other process needs to happen. She already has the ownership of the account. It's a legally enforceable law basically, because she is, by law, the owner of the account. And so there's no need to, again, bring the courts into this, go through probate. So then the third option is probate. Probate is, where you don't have one of these first two options. So let's say in your house, you don't have a beneficiary named and you don't own it jointly with somebody. Well, then that means that, okay, your home would go through the probate process. The probate process is going through the court system. So, okay, your house, or not your house, your estate, your house and whatever other assets you own that aren't caught by those first two buckets are going to go through this probate process in the courts.
Mhm.
And so when that happens, there's one of two ways that it goes through the probate court. The one we're talking about or have been talking about is, okay, if you have a will, if you have a valid will, that means that you have a testate estate, which basically means you have a valid will. And so the probate court, even though it has to go through the court still, it's going to try to carry out what your valid will says. Your executor will help to that end. If instead you don't have a will, then you have what's called an intestate estate. And so in that case, what happens is you don't have a valid will or you don't have a will at all. And so your assets are basically, what happens to them is just going to be determined by the court. So there's three mechanisms, right? Contract law and by probate. Under probate, there's two ways it can go through probate. Of all of those mechanisms, one of the big goals of an estate plan, a holistic estate plan, is to get as many assets in those first two buckets as we can, because those first two buckets avoid probate, right? And we'll say, well, but if you have a valid will, why does it matter, right? Probate court, just, okay, there's a valid will, these assets go there. Well, probate court or going through the probate process is a public ordeal. So remember, you're going through the court, right? So it is a public available thing, going through the court process, through the probate process. And so many people don't want that to happen to their assets, right? Many people don't want their assets to go through this public process that, okay, can be known if someone would go to look for those records, especially when we involve Bitcoin with this. And so we'll dive more into that aspect in a little bit, but just to finish out, okay, what are these documents? So we've got a will. Again, that's kind of naming the executor who's going to carry out your estate as a whole. If you have children, you might want to name a guardian there. If you have assets that just can't be, communicated or conveyed by contract or by law, you want to put those in there. The gun collection, the jewelry collection, the art collection, whatever it's going to be.
Mhm.
So below that then, so let's get away from the kind of material resources and let's talk about something for us personally. We have these things that are called power of attorneys. A power of attorney is a person who can basically act on your behalf when you are no longer able to do so. So you're incapacitated in some sense. So if I was out hiking in the mountains and a boulder fell on me, whatever, I didn't die, but I was knocked into a coma. A power of attorney is a person that I would name, my wife in this case, to basically be able to act on my behalf if I'm unable to do that. So make financial decisions for me and make medical decisions for me. These are the two primary, what we call power of attorney. So you have a financial power of attorney and a healthcare power of attorney. So again, these aren't really this isn't anything about I'm dead and these assets go here. This is I'm still alive and I need someone to make decisions for me. And again, most of the time, if you're married, this is just going to be your spouse initially. But this is again why we want to name those contingent aspects, because go back to the plane crash example. Say your spouse dies, but you live, but you're incapacitated. You're in a coma because you're just in a plane crash. Okay, well then your spouse actually can't, obviously can't be your power of attorney. So you need to name a contingent that can step in to fill that role, that can help pay the bills, pay for the kids' schooling, whatever it's going to be. And then specifically under the healthcare power of attorney, We have a few more documents that are kind of included. Sometimes it's all in one document package. Sometimes it's separate. Again, it kind of depends on the attorney. But in general, almost everybody's going to have what's called a living will and then a HIPAA authorization. So a living will
Mhm.
is basically where you get to state what you want to happen in end of life circumstances. So I'm in the coma, had the horrible thing happen. I'm in a vegetative state. Doesn't look like there's any chance for recovery. I'm just going to live as a vegetative state for forever, until I would naturally die. A living will allows me to say, okay, yeah, just put the pillow over my face. I don't want to live up in my head that long, or no, keep me alive by any means necessary. Um,
Mhm.
and you might think, well,
Yeah.
I don't really want to think about that. Well, yeah, nobody necessarily really does. But what's worse than having to make that decision for yourself? It's you asking somebody else to make that decision for you when they don't know what you want, right? Even your
Mhm.
spouse, like maybe you've
Mhm.
talked about this with your spouse, but that doesn't mean that if it was ever like, yes, this is what's what I want to happen. And certainly, again, and where I keep going back to with these circumstances, your spouse isn't there, so someone else completely has to make that decision. They're definitely not going to know. So how horrible for that person to say, okay, yeah, I guess pull the plug. I don't know. It seems like that was,
Yeah.
what he would want. That's just awful. So a living will allows you to specify what your wishes are, so that whoever your healthcare, it informs your power of attorney. It informs your healthcare power of attorney to say, hey, here's what I want to happen. So they don't have to try to make that determination on their own in an already obviously very stressful and very sad circumstance. And then the HIPAA authorization, that's a very simple, just something known as HIPAA within healthcare. It's basically just patient confidentiality. HIPAA authorization just says, hey, my power of attorney, yes, you can talk with them about my healthcare needs um, with that. And the important thing to, kind of realize or recognize with powers of attorneys, or consider, I should say, is there's basically two primary formats or primary ways they can be enacted. So you have what's known as a springing power of attorney or a durable power of attorney. So a durable power of attorney means as soon as those documents are in force, that person can act as your power of attorney. A springing power of attorney means only when certain qualifications are met does this power of attorney come into enforce. So a lot of times, if you're going to do springing, it's going to be, well, I'm incapacitated, and springing
Mhm.
seems nice, but what's difficult is, okay, how do you actually determine what is incapacitation, what isn't, how, what there's a lot of mechanisms that have to go into that. So something to consider with
Mhm.
those two. Um, Anyways, moving on. So those are the primary, I would say those are like the bulk of the documents that you're going to have with an estate plan, or that most people, not most people, everybody should have with an estate plan. Again, you're going to want a will, a healthcare power of attorney, or a financial power of attorney, a healthcare power of attorney, and then a living will and a HIPAA authorization under that, under those buckets.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mitch. Oh,
No, I mean that's great. Yeah, I would. Well, one thing I was just going to point out is just kind of an overarching idea here is really what you're doing with this entire estate plan is you're putting when we talk about this idea of sovereignty, you are bringing that back into your hands so that the court or someone else is not making decisions for you that you wouldn't want to be making decisions for you, or somebody's not going to be the guardian of your kids, like you said. What if they choose somebody that, who knows, you didn't like in your family, but the court didn't know that. So all of a sudden now your kids are being taken care of by somebody that you wouldn't want your kids to be taken care of. So when we're talking about this again, the idea of sovereignty and kind of personal, autonomy, I guess, this is what you're doing this while you're still alive and able to do it, but it's going to, come into play when you're not alive or not able to do it. And so if you want to be able to maintain as much as your sovereignty as possible, need to make sure to get this taken care of as soon as possible, because who knows, we could you could finish up listening to this podcast and all of a sudden, or maybe while you're listening to this podcast, we're distracting you while you're driving or something. Anyways, the point is we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So although even if this may not seem urgent, it is, and it's very important. So I just wanted to bring up that idea that is, typically very important to Bitcoiners. This is something that can be really thought of in that way.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And to that end, this brings up the last document that not, again, isn't necessarily required, like I would say the other documents are in every estate plan, but especially for Bitcoiners is highly recommended, and that's a trust. Trust, used to be, I think, right? You get the old like trust fund baby type thing, trust fund kid, right? Like it used to be this like,
Mm,
almost pejorative thing, but anymore, trusts are pretty stinking common. And there is so many different types of trust that we're not going to get into the details of all of those today. But at a very fundamental, what trusts are is they're a legal contract, which is we'll come back to that why that's big in a minute. But they're a legal contract where a trustee holds and manages assets on behalf of some sort of beneficiaries that are already named in the trust. So this management of those assets that can happen, now that can happen after your death. It doesn't matter, but it's a legal contract where the trust. So the trust is a separate entity now holds assets instead of you personally, and then you name a trustee that then manages those assets for the benefit of whatever beneficiaries or whatever beneficiaries are in that trust. So the reason why trust is important in that legal contract sense is because if what I started with or talked about a while ago, that okay, how do assets pass, right? So you die, how do your assets get to the people you want them to go? Yeah, by contract, by law, probate. Probate, that's what a will is going to go through again, court process. By trust being a legal contract, okay, now we have a mechanism to say, okay, we want these assets to go to this person or these peoples that is out, it can be outside of the probate process. So no longer does it have to be a public process where a judge gets any say. No, it's a binding legal contract that says, okay, these assets go there. Furthermore, with a trust, something you can do with that you can't do with a will is basically get much more detailed on how those assets pass. So what I mean by this
mm,
is that okay, it's not just I die. And again, if I have a will, okay, I die, my Bitcoin, is going to be in my will. So okay, I want my Bitcoin to go equally to my children. Well, that just means that okay, you die, your Bitcoin are going to equally go to your children as soon as you die. With a trust, I can say, okay, I die, and I want my Bitcoin to go to my children, but I don't want that to happen until they're 18. And even at 18, I want it to be, only 50% of it. And then the other 30% at age 21, and then the remaining balance at age 26. You could even go further and say, well, at age 18, assuming they graduated high school, age 21, assuming they're about to graduate college, age 26, assuming they're married. You can put more stipulations
mm,
around it, which does lead to a quick aside that is more a personal philosophy thing more than a formal consideration for this. But um, the name trust is about as oxymoronic as you can get, I think, because at the end of the day, the way that most people use trust, because they do use them, this whole mechanism where I say you can kind of control assets after you die, um, no matter if it's what I just described or some more complex things that we're not going to get into today. In effect,
mhm,
the way most people use those mechanisms is actually because of a lack of trust. So they don't trust their
mm,
children. They don't trust their beneficiaries. They don't trust God and that God is going to care for them and, basically not care for their children, but, have their children basically step up to the plate, so to say, if they're young. Um, but it implies a
mm,
lack of trust. And actually, I think it's pretty indicative of kind of the world we're living in now. It's like trust is a way to maintain control over things when you're no longer here. We're so control freak censored that, okay, we now have made it a good thing to do this. We now made it, okay, this is the primary reason you want to trust is to maintain this control. Because, yeah, who knows what whoever else is going to do down the road? No, it is a complete lack of trust. And talk about, okay, how do your children feel? Even if they don't necessarily formally recognize that, there is some sort of informal, okay, now I got to wait for this or that or whatever. And anyways, aside back, I do think that's oxymoronic for me and for a Bitcoiner. That doesn't mean we can't do those options. Like they're still prudent. We're still called to be prudent with our resources, right? Um, But the other
Mm-hmm.
aspect of the trust, the first one I talked about, that is the primary reason we want to have a trust, is that it avoids probate. We talk about, as you said, sovereignty, privacy. Well, probate process ain't going to do that. A trust does. And a trust can be
Yeah.
very simple. So the simplest trust,
Mm-hmm.
and the one we likely will talk most about today, is called a revocable trust. So a revocable trust, all that is yes, it's a separate legal entity, but you, as the grantor, the one who forms the trust or formed the trust, you maintain full control over the trust, full autonomy over the trust, and fully responsible for all the assets in the trust. So there's no sort of, okay, you put in the assets in the trust and now you got some stipulations. No, it's just a separate entity that for estate planning purposes is very beneficial. But for your actual, day-to-day use, it's okay. It's the same as if you owned it
Mm-hmm.
outright. It's just now that those assets are avoiding probate by you owning it under that mechanism. So that's a much more private and a much more sovereign way to hold our Bitcoin, if we're going to hold it
Yeah.
within a trust versus just having it go through probate there. So there's other trusts I think you might hear a lot, and we're going to talk about in a future episode, is an irrevocable trust. Just to briefly touch on that, all that really is that you no longer maintain control or ownership of those assets once those go in the trust. And there's good reasons why we
Yeah.
would want to consider that for certain situations, but by and large, for most people, when we're talking through a Bitcoin estate plan or a Bitcoin inheritance plan, it should probably just be a revocable trust. It is the rule is a revocable trust. The exception is a revocable plus probably an irrevocable trust. So those are kind of the differences in a very broad bucket. And then even under both of those, revocable and irrevocable, there's many different options and considerations. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that,
Yeah.
Mitch.
Yeah. I think a couple things are good to mention. Well, I will just say, when we're talking about a will versus a trust, we do typically recommend pretty much everyone set up, this revocable trust that you're mentioning because of these aspects. Yeah, you can set up a will and it may get the job done, but again, you're losing control and you're losing privacy by going through the probate process. And anyone who owns a significant amount of Bitcoin, I would imagine values privacy to some extent, to where they do not want their Bitcoin to go through the probate process. Now it's public knowledge how much and who gets your Bitcoin. How much Bitcoin and who gets it. So now there's really a target on their back potentially, for violence. Like we've talked about it in our self custody framework episode previously. And so we want to avoid that, and we want to be able to set up our heirs for success. We'll also get into here in just a minute, the difference between, you just gave them the keys, but you also passed the legal title to them. We'll touch on that, which plays into this aspect of making sure that you're protecting your heirs, with this estate plan rather than exposing them to potential risks. So I just wanted to touch on that. If you're somebody who's sitting here right now has no estate plan in place, you probably would just, if you're listening to this, you probably would just go straight to the revocable living trust structure, um, you know, uh, because of these reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I will just also touch on the powers of attorney. There's the trust versus will consideration that we've just talked about, but you'll still need these power of attorneys in place, in addition to those. So it's not like I'm going to do a will and this power of attorney, or I'm going to do a trust. You still need that, power of attorney in place for the incapacitation aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I'll mention is, if you do have minor children, young children, they cannot, you were saying with the trust, you can basically put in the stipulation of they can't access these assets until they're 18, 21, whatever. You have the flexibility to really do whatever you want with that. But if you don't have anything in place, those assets, even though they may go to your children, they may be the beneficiaries of those assets, there will still need to be someone in place making decisions for them while they are still a minor. And so if you don't stipulate who you want that to be, then, somebody else is going to be making decisions with your money. It's supposed to be for the benefit of your kids, whether or not it's going to be, Who knows? It depends who that person is, So that's also another consideration. If you don't want your sister or your aunt or whatever, your brother, whoever, to be making financial decisions for your children, well, then you probably need to make sure that you get this into place. So I just wanted to
That's
point out
actually a
that
great point.
aspect.
That's a great point, because this brings up, a lot of people. So there's a lot of what we call designations that we laid out today, right? We said an executor of a will, a guardian of the children, a power of attorney, both healthcare and financial, a trustee on our trust, right? All these people that we got to kind of say, okay, who's going to do what, right? And most of the time, what most people just want to do is be like, okay, they're all the same. So it's all my wife, and then it's all this person for the next ones. But you just brought up a great
Mm-hmm.
point, the minor children specifically. So, with a will, we're always, going to name that guardian through there. That mechanism is always coming through the will. So we're going to name a guardian who's going to take care, like who's physically taking care of your children. Where are they going to live if you and your spouse die, you and your wife die? But that doesn't mean
Yeah.
that if we have a trust that owns Bitcoin, that means that, okay, A, that those kids can't access that Bitcoin right away, but even B, that trustee, now that you are deceased, right? So no, you're no longer here, your spouse is no longer here, so you have someone else managing that trust. That trustee has to be the same person as the guardian. In fact, this is another great reason why a lot of people enact a trust, because this is where, hey, maybe I don't trust this all so much, comes into play. Because what you have is you can name, okay, the same person guardian and same person as the trustee. They have full control of your children and of their assets. And okay, yes, maybe in the trust you say, well, it's only to be used for their healthcare, wellness, medical, education, that sort of stuff. But they control your children, they control your assets. Like, yes, could they theoretically, could something come back and someone come back and sue them, like your kids, if they missed or did things wrong? Sure. Um, is that easy to prove? No. So this is where actually naming a guardian and a trustee as separate people, as maybe even separate complete entities, can be really beneficial. So you have one person that's watching for the welfare of your children, raising them. You have another person that is responsible for the financial aspects of the children, right? And maintaining that trust. And again, like, you could put in those
Yeah.
stipulations that they still can't get it to 18, or you could just say they get it right away. It's just I don't want them to be the managers of the money, so to say, or I don't want the guardians to be the manager of the money. So the kids can have access to it
Yeah.
however they want. The guardians can have access to it for healthcare, wellness, whatever. But it always has to go through this trustee. And then at some point you would say, okay, once they're old enough, then they can just take over full ownership of it. But it's like, that's where it does make sense, because a 6-year-old truly can't, like, they literally can't make decisions around money. That's where a trustee is, helpful. It's not that they can't access it in the case of, okay, you got to wait till 18 or whatever. It's just that they're
Mhm.
incapable of doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we start to think about incorporating Bitcoin in this aspect, okay, well, what if all of a sudden you have somebody that you did want to be the guardian of your kids, but knows nothing about Bitcoin? Well, then we might run into some issues. What if they just sell it? They're like, oh, this is a scam, whatever. They believe what the news is saying, who knows? Most of the people who are buying Bitcoin, they see it as a long-term asset, maybe even a generational wealth transfer asset, which is, what we see it as. And so with the appreciation potential, your kids may be guardian by somebody else for, who knows how long. But then you're expecting that person to be able to hold on to, let's say your portfolio or your asset allocation, if you want to think about it that way, 60% of your net worth is in Bitcoin. Well, okay, is that person going to be intelligent or educated enough to hold on to that? Or are they going to, be told by some normie financial advisor to, diversify out? Who knows? The point is, making sure that you're actually thinking about this stuff is important, because if you want the Bitcoin to actually benefit your kids, if something were to happen tomorrow, this is a part of that. It's not just, oh, they get the keys and here we go. That's like so short-sighted and you're basically jeopardizing the financial freedom of your children that you are working so hard to be able to achieve. So yeah, I just want to hammer on that, because if somebody is going to be taking over a significant amount of assets and they don't understand Bitcoin, they're going to go talk to somebody and they're going to go like knock on the door of Edward Jones or something, and all of a sudden your Bitcoin stack's gone. Just saying.
Yeah.
So something to think about. Also, one thing I did not mention earlier that I wanted to is, this revocable trust that we're talking about. It gives you that privacy when you pass, but it also gives you privacy now, because you don't have to name that trust your name or your family's name or whatever. And then when you put those assets, I was watching. It was yesterday actually. I was watching Lioness. It's a show on Paramount Plus. It's pretty good. I was watching it with Claire, my wife, and they were doing some like research for a mission basically. And they're like, we need to look up who owns the houses around this house, the house of the target basically. So they were thinking that, the cartel had some security in these other houses guarding this guy that they wouldn't be aware of. They just assumed it's a neighbor. They don't know what's going on, but the neighbor might be, the security team for this other guy. And so they were looking up who owns the houses, and the guy said, oh, well, they're all owned by trusts. We don't know. And so that just was a good reminder, and perfect for this conversation of, somebody looks up your house, you can just Google that. Like you can figure out who owns that house, and then you'll know. So that's something else to think about. You're putting your assets into this trust. It gives you that anonymity right now, not just when you pass away by avoiding probate.
That's great, man. Seriously, because that right there, this kind of ties in more. It's estate planning somewhat, because it's estate planning at the end of the day. You've got to protect the assets, and then got to transfer the assets, and then you have to make some determination of what happens after. But with the right now, yeah, we talk about what are the potential acts of violence. Like we talked about public figure risk, right? With our custody framework. I mean, this is exactly that. Even if you're not necessarily a big public figure, but you're posting about Bitcoin online, right? Some random person, especially if you're not very OPSEC friendly, so you're just like, yeah, in Colorado, blah, 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 whatever, they can just go and start to basically just look at county records, look at different counties, look up your name, and all of a sudden, oh, they've got your home address, right? Okay, cool. I got the home address. I know they own Bitcoin. I'm going to go pay them a visit. Right. So this is where, Mitch, you're getting this is like, okay, well, this isn't just a Bitcoin thing. Put your home in the trust, because trust, you still own the trust. You can name the trust, whatever, Bitcoin Trust 4. Nobody's going to know who owns Bitcoin Trust 4, because that's all that's going to show up on any sort of public record. And again,
Gosh, don't name it that. Come on, man. What? We're talking about privacy here. You want to name it Bitcoin Trust?
Oh, sorry. Ripple Trust. Nobody's going to come after the house owned by the Ripple Trust.
Oh no.
Anywho, right? So they're going to look it up. They're just going to see, it's
Yeah.
owned by the trust. It's not your name. Okay, well, no, I mean, nobody's going to find that anyways, unless they somehow already know your address. So it's just another way of protecting your privacy, as you're saying now. Not only just from the aspect of, hey, that's probably something we want, but the aspect of, oh, I own Bitcoin, and if I'm doing any sort of security for it at home, okay, that's probably a really good thing to do. So, that's a great point. But on this point of, okay, how do we incorporate Bitcoin into all of what we just talked about? We've kind of been, poking around at this a little bit, and how do we have to do it? The first thing, probably to realize about this, is that when you pass away, your assets get conveyed in two primary ownership of your assets, I should say, get conveyed in two primary ways. So one is possession, physical possession, and the other one is legal title. Now, there's going to be some caveats for this. Like I know with Wyoming, they have really good bearer asset laws. So a lot of this title aspect is kind of disregarded for that. And I don't know if there's any other states. I think it's just Wyoming, but I'm just going to talk. And again, this is general. Come talk to us if you want specific advice. So again, there's two aspects of how possession or ownership gets conveyed if you die: possession, legal title. With Bitcoin, how do these get conveyed? Well, the one a lot of people like to talk about today is possession, right? This is where we get to those inheritance protocols that everybody talks about. especially the collaborative custody providers. Hey, we'll give you an inheritance protocol. Great. Okay. You know what that does? It helps convey possession. What ultimately is possession? Well, if what I say in just a second doesn't make sense to you, go listen to our last episode. What conveys possession is who physically owns the private keys. So, okay, you've got your, seed phrase that has your keys and effect on them. You own that asset as far as possession is concerned. You are in possession of that asset, so you own that aspect of it. So you're the owner of the possession aspect of it. And I'll come back to this in a minute to talk about the inheritance protocols. The other half, legal title. This is not who owns the private keys. This is literally the legal mechanism in which ownership is conveyed. This is what we've been talking about, all today, right? We've got three ways: contract, law, and probate. That's who determines how legal title gets conveyed from you to another person to determine ownership of an asset. That is the aspect that hardly anybody really discusses in all this, and it's probably it's not more important, because if you can't convey possession, you don't have Bitcoin. But it is just about as important.
Not your keys, not your coin, man.
Yeah, right. So, but again, what we're getting to here is that if all you do is have some sort of mechanism to say, okay, I have these keys go to this person when I die, congratulations, you've effectively conveyed possession. You have not conveyed legal title. Some people would say, well, I don't care. Why does that matter? I'm not going to tell the government about it anyways. You go right ahead. But when your beneficiaries come back and argue about, no, dad said it was going to be half and half. No, dad said this, dad said that, or uncle said this, or uncle said that, whatever. How are they going to settle that? Okay, now you've just caused rift in your family. That's a minor one. A more major one is, okay, you convey possession. That's all you do. You don't convey legal title. You don't talk about it. So what you, in effect, have done is you have not reported an asset that was part of your estate at the time of your death, or you've instructed your executor to not do that. So now what happens? Well, your executor probably has legal action taken against them if this ever gets found out. Your beneficiaries, so your children likely in this, they're probably going to have legal action taken against them if this ever gets found out. And okay, how are they going to find out? Well, as much as Bitcoiners like to say, never sell your Bitcoin, which is one of the stupidest mantras in our space, but neither here nor there, your beneficiaries probably are going to want to use that Bitcoin, right? Especially if it's highly appreciated. Like, yeah, they're probably going to want to use that to go buy the house. And what's that house going to, what are they going to do when they're trying to say, okay, where are these funds coming from? Try to source those funds, irregardless of whether that's okay that they're trying to verify funds. Like, that's a whole other conversation,
Yeah.
but it is the reality of today. They're going to be like, where'd those come from? Like, oh yeah, dad just gave them to me. And, it's like, okay, well, how did dad give them to you? We don't show legal title of these. We don't show anything there. It's like, these weren't part of the estate. It's like, okay, this is where, again, if that's a risk you want to run, go right ahead. I'm never going to recommend that to do for any reason. But if that's a risk you want to take, go right ahead and go for it. But we'll come back to that aspect in a minute. I want to jump back over to the possession. So legal title, again, this is just how the legal title is conveyed. That's contract, law, probate. So go ahead.
Yeah, before you switch back, I mean, I think it's just, you said that that's a minor consideration around maybe interfamily disputes here, but let's be honest, that's pretty common. It may be minor, it could turn into a major problem, and it's a very common thing. So if somebody, like, especially when we're talking about Bitcoin, we expect large amounts, fiat denominated terms, to be included. Maybe you own 10 Bitcoin right now and it's $900,000, but 5-10 years from now, it has 10x from there, whatever. It's $9 million all of a sudden. Like, we're talking about large amounts. And so that just increases the likelihood of there being disputes. I mean, it's, whether we like it or not, I would say the biggest contender for our heart that Jesus spoke against is money. And he knew that. And so that's why he spoke so much about money in the first place, because our hearts can very easily come to put money as a big idol in our lives, and it can cause us to do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. And so Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reiterate the importance of that consideration because of how likely it can be in families.
Mm-hmm. For sure. For sure. That's great. Yeah. And so to hop back over to the possession aspect then. Um, so again, we hear these inheritance protocols a lot today. An inheritance protocol, at the end of the day, all that is some sort of effective means to get keys from person A to person B at some predetermined point in the future. So again, it's just, okay, keys go to this person, keys go to that person. Most of the time, this is at our death. That's what most of those inheritance protocols are doing, which again is not bad. It's good to help with that or to do that. But most of the time, if not all of the time, as far as I know, there's only one wallet that is actually doing this sort of mechanism on chain. Every other wallet is doing this mechanism just by their own software. They have their own verification process to say, yep, these assets go to this person at this point in time. And the thing to realize here is it's just not sufficient, right? They called it an inheritance protocol as if that's the only thing you needed to do, but it's not. Again, it's only covering one half of what constitutes ownership of an asset. And so with those inheritance protocols, while they're good, they're not great. And to tie this back in with some of what we talked about in our last conversation, the inheritance protocols, those are almost always done through collaborative custody providers, right? So there's not really anybody who is saying, hey, we can provide an inheritance protocol outside of doing collaborative custody. So you have to do collaborative custody to get these. And again, if you're worried about your privacy, well, I don't want to do that. So, okay, how do we then convey those assets, the possession of those assets after you died if we don't have one of those mechanisms, which again, those mechanisms are just something those companies made up. So it's like you still got to kind of trust the company to do what they say they're going to do. And at the end of the day,
Yeah.
like, okay, are they, what fees are they charging? One, two, even if they do help get it to whatever beneficiary, like, is your beneficiary still going to be able to move Bitcoin from there? Like, okay, cool, they'll help them. Here's your key, here's your wallet, off you go. The beneficiary, your wife, your kids are sitting there like, as you like to say, a lot of people love the Bitcoin or don't know anything about the Bitcoin. So it's like, okay, cool, they got the Bitcoin, but they can't do anything with it. And so this is
Mm.
where we come in and say, hey, that's why you need someone on your side to actually go through this with you and to be there for you if this were to happen. A physical person that you can trust, that you can talk to, that knows your financial situation, i.e., us. And that's where our inheritance protocol comes from. We have developed our own inheritance protocol that basically says, hey, we don't care what the custody mechanism is. We don't care if you're doing pure single sig self custody, if you're going to do collaborative custody, multi custody, or multi sig custody, whatever it is. We don't care. We can help make sure that possession gets from you to whoever you want it. And that is not necessarily us. We're not taking ownership of those assets. That is just us helping facilitate that because we know you, we have the relationship with you.
Mm. Yeah, I was just gonna ask there if you could boil down what an inheritance, maybe what a complete inheritance protocol is,
Mm-hmm.
because we're talking through this conveying possession, conveying title. When people will say, they're hearing inheritance protocol, like you're talking about from collaborative custody providers, but can you just describe what a complete inheritance? I mean, we already have, but let's just connect the dots really of what a complete inheritance protocol is,
Mm-hmm.
and then what that doesn't have to look like you're saying, a collaborative custody setup.
Yeah. So yeah, let's start from the top. So inheritance always starts with someone already owns something. So we own our Bitcoin, however we own it. The next step is, okay, we want this Bitcoin to go to somebody when we die or something. It could be a corporation, but we're just going to talk through families with kids because it's just easier because I have kids, so it's easier for me to think through. Use that example. So, okay, we want that Bitcoin to go to somebody, right? So that's really the first step of thinking through inheritance is we want our asset to go somewhere when we die. Okay, cool. So we've established that I want my asset to go to my wife, Heather, if I were to die. For both to die, I want it to go to my son, Miles, and we're going to have a kid here soon. So, whoever else, whatever we name that one, we'll find out. I want that, right? Okay, so we've established what we want to happen. So the inheritance functionality then is, how do we facilitate that? How do we facilitate that I own asset and I own the private keys to my Bitcoin, and I can take that, and either, whether it's directly the same private keys or it's doing some sort of mechanism to make a new wallet with separate private keys, doesn't matter. How do I facilitate that now whoever I want to own that Bitcoin after I die can actually own that, can own the private key so they have possession of it? And that, and then, okay, furthermore, our inheritance protocol is, okay, we can get it to that next person. We can say, okay, here's where we want it to go. We got it to that person. We can also make sure that that person then can do what they need to do with that Bitcoin. It's not just, okay, there's your wallet, there you go, right? All right, have fun, whatever. Here's your private keys. Take, go do whatever. And it's like, it's stuck. It becomes, one of the 3 million lost coins or however many are out there right now. And so that again, that's okay. So we've got we want it to go somewhere. We make sure that we've got the game plan for how it gets to that person. And then furthermore, okay, that person can then actually utilize those assets to do whatever they need to do or want to do with those assets. And so there's certainly lots of different considerations within that. But really what it gets to is just that we have the partnership there. And again, all these inheritance protocols are just some sort of like, not on chain, but digital way to replicate that. So, okay, you need to submit a death certificate or whatever, or maybe you have a time lock on a passphrase or something, and then if that time lock expires and you haven't updated your passphrase, that automatically goes somewhere. Like, those are both really not great solutions. Time locks aren't really great solutions for inheritance in general because we don't know when we're going to die. So that means we just have to kind of keep updating them every so often, right? So that's where our relationship is in a human relationship, whether it's us or otherwise. But I don't know if anybody else is doing what we're doing. So our relationship is saying, hey, we don't know when you're going to die, so we're not going to put a time lock on it, even though, yes, we could update the time locks, whatever. We're just going to say, we know you, we know your situation, we know how you hold your Bitcoin. We don't know your private keys, but we know maybe where you store them. We don't know specifically where that, but your wife or whoever needs to know that can know it. And so we're going, again, to help facilitate, to make sure, okay, they can get access to it, and then they can actually use it however they need to use it from there. Does that answer your question, hopefully?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about beforehand with conveying legal title and conveying possession, facilitating possession, maybe is the better way to say it. That is a complete inheritance protocol if we want to think about it that way. And I may even also throw in a third consideration of the education piece, which you're saying and speaking to with, okay, they got the keys now. What do they do? Like they don't know what Bitcoin is. They don't know how it maybe fits in their financial plan now, because now it's their asset. So what should they be doing with it to, further benefit from it financially? And so there's really that maybe third, consideration of that education where, if you just have a software and, collaborative custody inheritance protocol, they may be able to get that, possession facilitated, but that's it. By not conveying the legal title, then you are exposing your heirs to tax fraud litigation risks that you already talked about, earlier, which is, if you actually want the best, for your heirs, then you'll do what you can now to protect them in the event of that happening. And this is how you do it. And then that third piece that we're saying with the education, cool. Maybe we got the legal title conveyed, we conveyed possession, but they don't know what to do now. That could very easily turn into a disaster quickly, and so that's, this third consideration where, a relationship like ours makes a lot of sense for somebody because we already know your full financial picture. We already have built relationships with your family members. So we know what your wishes are and we know the people already. So they trust us and they know that you trust us. So they can come to us to make sure that this is all taken care of, even if it is your executor, whoever. Maybe it's not the ultimate beneficiary of the assets, but it's the person who's going to be facilitating this. They can come to us and be like, hey, what do I need to know? And then I just also want to reiterate what you said, that right now, this inheritance function that we're talking about it seems to only be offered by collaborative custody providers, but it does not have to be. The inheritance protocol at a foundational level is these things that we're talking about: legal title, possession, and then if you want to add in the education. That does not have to be taken care of or solved for by a collaborative custody company. It doesn't have to be. If you
Just
wanted to
like
have single sig, multi,
just like your life insurance needs don't have to be solved by a whole life policy. There's other options outside of it. Just to tie to something tangible that people hear about a lot.
yeah. I guess what I was trying to do is separate or delineate that an inheritance protocol is not proprietary to a collaborative custody provider. Like the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve is not only facilitated by that mechanism.
Yeah.
And I think you did a good job of explaining that. Man, we really got it. We really got into it there. Got going. What else have we not said?
I think
Yeah, I mean, I
maybe
think we
one
go ahead.
thing to just reiterate with this is just like what we're getting to, maybe not reiterate, but compound on what you just said, is that now and likely, you can never say forever, but for the foreseeable future with Bitcoin, inheritance protocols, as purported by many people in this space, do not really solve the inheritance problem as it needs to. And there's really no way that that is ever going to be solved via the mechanisms that these folks are using. Because you want to talk, I said there's like one wallet right now that does actually a formal time lock. So on chain time lock, where, okay, hey, if you don't update this time lock, then these keys will become active, or, whatever the mechanism you're going to use is. Um, Even with that, it still is only conveying possession. And actually, a lot of these sort of time lock mechanisms, just to reiterate this point, they're not really great because, okay, you put a time lock for 1,000 blocks into the future, 10,000, whatever it's going to be into the future. Probably has to be more than that, 10 blocks or 10 minutes per block. I'm not going to try to do that math. Just the equivalent of
Yeah,
2 years into the future in blocks. Okay, cool. You still have to then go and do something to push that out, or else all of a sudden now your Bitcoin's going to move to this new address, or a new key is going to become active. What it actually makes things more complex in a way. So again, this is where, okay, the relationship is, hey, we're going to help you set up the custody that you need to have. This is self-custody. Otherwise, we're going to help you set up the appropriate custody structure. We're not going to make things more complicated than they need to, whether it's informal time locks or formal time locks. We're going to know what needs to happen, and we're going to give you the information that you need to give to your spouse, to your beneficiaries, to whoever it is, to get your Bitcoin where it needs to go. And this is how it should be. I expect that, this is something that more and more people will hopefully begin to do, because it really is what should be done with this. But I suspect, because people like to sell products more than services, that we'll probably see more and more of the inheritance stuff, the general inheritance stuff, than anything else. But at any rate, where I was going with that is communication really is, foundational to any of this. Like, even if you just end up doing the, generic collaborative custody inheritance protocol, at the end of the day, your spouse still needs to know that they need to go to one of those companies' websites, and they know how to log in and know how to say, hey, my husband died, and get that Bitcoin, right? Like, there still needs to be communication aspects of this. So that the Bitcoin can get to your spouse, to your kids, to whoever it needs to get to, even if that means that it has to go through probate. Like, at the end of the day, okay, it's got to go through probate. Is it the end of the world? No, it's just that it's not ideal. And so maybe just to take like an example to try and, make this concrete. So, example of kind of the dichotomy we're talking to. On one side you have Tim, and on the other side you have John. Tim does nothing of what we've said today. John does everything of what we said today. So Tim owns Bitcoin, single sig wallet, single backup, no inheritance, no collaborative custody, no anything, no estate plan, no nothing. So Tim wants to pass he dies, and he wants his assets to go to his wife, Sally. Okay, well, first question, does Sally know he owns Bitcoin? Second question, if she does know he owns Bitcoin, does she know how to access that Bitcoin? Third question, If she does know how to access that Bitcoin, does she know how to move that Bitcoin? Fourth question is, if she knows how to move that Bitcoin, is she actually going to do that? Where is she, and how is she going to do that, right? Fifth question is, okay, how many people now actually know that Sally has that Bitcoin because it had to go through the probate process, right? So 5 kind of points of failure there where it's like, hey, these can all be avoided. These can all be mitigated at least, if not avoided. On the other side, we have John, I think is the example I use. So you have John, did everything we laid out. So we determined his custody structure that's appropriate for John. We communicated that custody structure to his spouse, Hannah. I hate making up names on the fly. John communicated that to Hannah. Not only that, John also communicated with us, his financial planner, and said, hey, I have it in this setup. Here's where the keys are. Hannah knows about this. Make sure we can get her to help. Furthermore, maybe even John helps, goes into our collaborative custody solution because that's actually just what's better for him. Who knows? But John does that one way or another. Hannah knows about it. Hannah can get access to it because we're aware and we can help her through that. All right, we've mitigated 2 of the risks right there. Furthermore, John, we helped him set up a revocable trust. We actually did an assignment of property into the trust that said, okay, here's all the XPubs where my Bitcoin is. Now my Bitcoin is in the trust. Okay, cool. So now that doesn't need to go through probate. It's not a public process. Then, okay, John dies, Hannah gets it. We help her, okay, here's where it's at. Here's where we need to go. Here's the legal title that we have to say, okay, yep, you can do that. We don't need to worry about probate. Then we take both of those and say, okay, you had the legal title. You also now have possession of the keys. Let's talk with Hannah and say, okay, what is going to be the best way for you to own this Bitcoin if that's the best thing for you to continue to do? You can see how those 2 things are so different, right? There's so much uncertainty on the left, or my left, probably right on the camera, and there's a lot of certainty on the right here. That is the beauty of what we've built on our inheritance protocol versus just kind of winging it, so to say.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And we could even, take that a step further with, writing out these instructions in addition to our support, and, giving those to you so that you've thought through all the considerations. Once we have that solid plan, we can write out all the instructions, put that in your, fireproof safe or whatever. We keep a copy as well, so that, we know exactly what it is. And, yeah, and it's just like you're saying, removing all the uncertainty, removing all the potential roadblocks, points of failure, stumbling, potholes, whatever you want to say, and making sure that at the most basic level, the hard work that you've put in and the risk that you took on Bitcoin, I would say still from an early perspective, if you were in Bitcoin back in 2017, it was still early and the future was unknown, and you took a risk with your wealth and, put a large amount into Bitcoin, and that risk has paid off now for you and we expect to continue to pay off. The point is, let's not let all that hard work and risk that you took, all that value that you put out into the world, let's actually allow that stored time and energy to pass on to your family members, and not let it falter. So anything else you think would be good to add on here? Like we mentioned in the very beginning, we're going to be diving deeper into, revocable trust versus irrevocable trust and why you may consider an irrevocable trust and why not. We'll be getting deeper into the weeds on that. But this was, again, more so this basics of estate planning and how Bitcoin fits into it or should fit into it if you're thinking about it correctly. So anything else you would add before we wrap up?
I don't think so. There's a lot more I'd like to add, but it's for the future conversation. So, no, I
Yeah.
think we got into basics and probably a little more than basics. So, no, I think it's good.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. This was something that I heard Matt McClintock say on one of his podcast appearances, but he's a estate planning attorney or was an estate planning attorney. And he was saying how, if we do see Bitcoin as, the important asset for the future that it is, then it deserves intentional planning around it. If you really believe in its potential, then you would intentionally plan all of your financial aspects to make sure that it continues to benefit you and your family into the future. And this is one of the big parts of that. And so this is, even tying back to kind of our catchphrase that we like to share of hodling is not a financial plan. It's just not. And this is one example as to why. You hodl your little tail off. But if you all of a sudden pass away on your drive to work and you don't have this in place, didn't matter. It was all for nothing. And
If your
so
Bitcoin can't
we want to make sure.
then you've failed.
Right. Exactly. Cool. Awesome. So yeah, if you're interested in, more specific advice to your situation, you can always check out our website, strongwealth.net. You can schedule a free discovery call with us there. And we'll get to know your situation, answer some questions about us, and see if it even makes sense to work together in the first place. But I think this is just even just a fraction of the value that we provide to people. And it's very valuable, just in and of itself, making sure that this is taken care of. So yeah, happy to answer any questions you have. If this, was valuable, please share it with somebody, in your life that could benefit from it as well. We just spoke with a guy earlier today that was saying, he came to understand Bitcoin because he went to, got lunch with a few of his buddies and they talked about this stuff once a month or something like that. If you're doing that kind of thing with your friends or your family, send them this and let's make sure that they get this ironed out and taken care of, ultimately so that your family can continue to prosper into the future. So thanks for listening all the way through. We'll be diving deep into more estate planning stuff in future episodes. But look forward to the next one.